There we go. Excellent. Okay. Well, thank you. And again, a gorgeous day to be sitting inside thinking about the end of the world. So today I'm going to be talking, that my talk is based on a book that I'm currently writing, which I'm calling Doomsday Dreams, the Apocalyptic Imagination in Contemporary Art. And it's, you know, I am an art critic, and so from that perspective, looking at the ways in which artists who are often informed by various religious traditions have sort of incorporated into their work visions, a worldview that really comes out of particularly the book of Revelation. In the book, I'm also looking at kind of other apocalyptic traditions, but today I am going to be talking about the American version of the apocalypse, which is very much linked to the book of Revelation. And a lot of this has to do with America's very special relationship to the apocalypse. And in fact, it goes back to the very beginning, even before America was America, to the beginning of the New World, which a phrase itself kind of indicates the notion of kind of apocalypse and the New Jerusalem. In 1500, at the end of his life, Christopher Columbus, the discoverer of America, wrote in a letter, "God made me the messenger of the new heaven and the new earth, of which he spoke in the Apocalypse of St. John, after having spoke of it through the mouth of Isaiah, and he showed me the spot where to find it." A century or so later, the Massachusetts Bay Governor John Winthrop coined a phrase that continues to reverberate throughout American politics and history. He said, "America is and will always be a shining city upon the hill." And this picture of a shining city upon the hill in part comes from the Sermon on the Mount, but it also harks back to the book of Revelation, and particularly the passage about the New Jerusalem. "I saw a holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, made ready like a bride adorned for her husband. I heard a loud voice proclaiming from the throne, 'Now at last God has his dwelling among men.'" So this notion of America as a shining city, as a special place, has led to what's been called American exceptionalism. And this is an idea that continues to run through American politics. Recently, the phrase has been used by almost every American president. John F. Kennedy, Ronald Reagan, Bill Clinton, Obama have all fashioned it in their speeches to talk about the idea of America as a beacon of democracy. In a kind of darker sense, the notion of American exceptionalism also leads to a pervasive vision of America as a Christian social utopia, and therefore a somewhat exclusive vision of who is and is not America. This has been distorted currently into Trump's notion, "Make America Great Again." And so now the current symbol of the shining city on the hill is this, a gilded city dominated by a flashing Trump sign. The book of Revelation underlies America's unique religiosity. It's often said that America has the most believers in the developed world. And in 2010, a Pew poll said that 41% of Americans believe in the end times. It's hard for me to believe that's totally accurate, but it apparently, you know, it's a very large portion of American population that is very much waiting for the end. And a lot of this is linked to what Harold Bloom, the literary critic, has called the American religion. He wrote a very interesting and provocative book by that title. And the book refers to America's homegrown religions. We have our very special, the Mormons, the Southern Baptists, the Pentecostals, the Seventh-day Adventists, the Jehovah's Witnesses, and the Christian Scientists. And Bloom describes all these as focused on the believer's personal relationship with God. He says that they're radically individualistic in a way that's very American, and that they're always millennial, always looking towards the end as both a destruction and a renewal. So what happens is that the book of Revelation reinforces the American religion, and I think American political thinking in ways that emphasize the sectarian, the literalism of the Bible, and the Manichean belief system of absolute distinction between good and evil. And in contrast to the utopianism of the politicians and their shining cities on the hill, in these American religions, we see some of the dark side of the book of Revelation, the focus on the battle of good and evil, the distrust of outsiders, the fear of the Antichrist, and the resistance to modernity. And I think that there are elements of all of these in the very powerful support that Trump has received from evangelical Christians. So the result is that the kind of influence of the book of Revelation on America is a contradictory mix of hope and pessimism. On the one hand, as I mentioned, there's this kind of optimism that comes from the founders' belief in America as the New Jerusalem. But on the other hand, there is America's history of brutal conflicts, from the American Revolution, the Civil War, the Cold War, Vietnam, the current clash of civilizations, and the current culture war between the red and blue states. And all of these tend to be cast by protagonists as salvos in Revelation's final battle of good and evil. So it's a way that in America often we think about conflicts, and therefore determines in certain ways what our options are. So what I want to address today is a question: what does the book of Revelation mean in America today? What is its place in larger culture? And for me, as an art critic, I always find that art is a very useful way of trying to understand undercurrents that are going on beneath the surface. And the book of Revelation, as it turns out, is a very powerful influence on both believers and on secularists. So it's not just these adherents to the American religion, but it really, I think, it ripples out into the larger culture as well. And what I find is that both believers and secularists in the art world tend to explore the sense, a kind of the more anti-utopian sense of Revelation and apocalypse, the sense that the forces of darkness are ascendant. And there's much more emphasis on the destructive rather than the salvic aspects of the apocalyptic narrative. But of course, there are essential differences between the believers and the secularists. And I want to turn first to the believers among artists in America today. And for what we refer to as outsider artists or visionary artists, the book of Revelation often serves as an actual blueprint of human history. And for many of these artists, their task is to produce literal representations of the visions in the book of Revelation. Many of them feel that they were called directly by God to translate the visions of Revelations into art. Mostly they are not trained, and often they kind of exist at a remove from what we would call the mainstream art world. It's also interesting that many of them are rooted in Southern evangelicalism, which tends to have a kind of belief in the absolute authority of the Bible. Their art is inspired by visions. It's often, they believe, a direct communication with God. There's again a difference between white and black African-American visionary artists. For the whites, often we see that the day of reckoning is important to them because it overturns what is in America still the stinging defeat in the Civil War, which is a fault line that continues to run through American culture, and I think is, again, this sort of red and blue culture war that we have right now is very much tied to that. For African Americans, however, the day of reckoning has a somewhat different connotation because it's tied to the legacy of slavery and the still unfulfilled promises of liberation. So I want to begin with Howard Finster, outsider / visionary artist, who was born in Georgia and he acted as a Baptist preacher for 40 years before being called to paint sacred art by God at age 60. And he created what he called sermons in paint. These were evangelical messages that combined text and images in, again, this kind of very hallucinatory way that is reflective of the book of Revelation. There are actual quotations from the book of Revelation. There are also his personal commentaries. Here, as in much of his work, in this work, you see the beasts and demons of the book of Revelation sort of brought to task to scare viewers into repentance. Another example here, a feeling of darkness, or as he says here, the sense of evils multiplying. Again, we recognize the seven-headed beast. We recognize a number of kind of familiar characters from Revelation, as well as other motifs. And sort of bringing these all together, again, as a way of scaring people straight, in a way. Similarly, is the artist William Thomas Thompson, who is from South Carolina. He is a self-described, self-made millionaire who talks about the fact that he lost his fortune in the late 1980s. He was an importer of silk flowers. The market dried up. And at the same time that that happened, he contracted a disease, Guillain-Barré syndrome, which is a sort of semi-paralyzing ailment. And in this dark time, he was in church one day and he experienced a vision of the apocalypse during a church service, and God again directly told him that he should paint the entire book of Revelation, and he has spent the rest of his years, he continues to do that. In his case, his handicap, his semi-paralyzed state, has been an asset because he paints on the floor with these kind of loose, expressionistic brush strokes, which seem to be very much in keeping with the spirit of the book of Revelation. And here you can see again, this is from one of his panoramic paintings, and again you can see that there's the Whore of Babylon, the seven-headed beast. I mean, many of these are familiar characters. Here, again, the seven-headed beast and the Whore of Babylon, again, Rome, Babylon, many of the images that we've been talking about throughout this conference appear here. And like Howard Finster, he tends to focus on the hellfire and brimstone aspects of the apocalypse and, with particular relish, the destruction of the non-believers. The third outsider visionary artist I want to talk about is James Hampton, and he's an African American. So again, a somewhat different take. He was born in 1909 to an African American sharecropper family, again in the South. He was raised as a fundamentalist Baptist. He spent his life apparently uneventfully, mostly in Washington, D.C., doing jobs like he was a short order cook, a drafty, a night janitor, kind of various things. And it wasn't until after his death that it was discovered that he had spent the last 20 years of his life creating this amazing throne installation, which also there were sort of voluminous writings about it. And he called it the throne of the third heaven of the nation's Millennium General Assembly, again, based directly on the passages from the book of Revelation when John is given a glimpse of the throne of God. And it's a room-sized installation that he created in a rented garage. And it's created from found and scavenged materials, among them aluminum and gold foil, discarded furniture, desk blotters, cardboard rolls, jelly glasses, mirror shards, light bulbs. You can see some of those elements here. And it consists of 180 separate objects, among them an altar, a throne, tables, pulpits, mercy seats. And these are often inscribed with texts from the book of Revelation. And it's also designed to reflect the separation of the saved and the damned, so that there are objects referring to the New Testament on the right side of the central throne and to the Old Testament on the left. And in his writing, there's evidence that he felt that upon completion of this work, he was going to use it as the basis of a new religion. So this is the believers and the way that they have been impacted by the book of Revelation. I turn now to the secularists, and these are contemporary artists, generally art school trained, very much a part of the mainstream art world, but generally also coming from intensely religious backgrounds. And they use the apocalypse as a metaphor. It becomes a way for them to confront personal and social contradictions. And so in their hands, the book of Revelation offers images that can be reconfigured as personalized explorations of evil, guilt, judgment, and salvation. And their works are also notable for the way in which they fuse popular culture and religion. So they mix this kind of visionary language that we've seen in the outsider artists with a postmodern art language, sort of more acceptable to the mainstream art world. So I want to begin with Jim Shaw, who talks about the fact that he recoiled from a conventional Episcopalian upbringing. He was raised in rural Michigan, by falling in with what he calls a group of rebellious Catholics, which included the artist Mike Kelly and others. And they were in a band together. Then for a while, Shaw worked as a special effects designer for various offbeat Hollywood films, all of which, as we will see, kind of enters into the kind of work that he does. Shaw has also been fascinated with the religious sects in America, basically Bloom's American religions, that resist the pull of modernity. And he's compiled this amazing archive of the various products of America's esoteric belief systems. I mean, and it fills many rooms. It's been shown now in a number of museums. It's under the name The Hidden World, the idea being that this is a thing that's going on in America kind of under the radar of kind of most of us in the, what we feel like the more mainstream culture. And it's this is one of the installations of The Hidden World, just a small portion of it. Basically, it consists of a collection of posters, pamphlets, videos, banners, comic books, various other kinds of ephemera. And it's not just about kind of religions per se, fringe religions, but also, as he says, crackpot science, conspiracy theories, secret societies, and paranormal research. So all of these things that, in a way, are very, very American in this kind of hidden way. So he's made this compilation and he presents it as a kind of artwork, but he also, in his own artworks that he creates, he borrows from the materials and from the kind of style of these multiple sources to create works that use a very personal language, again, to talk about this in a way, kind of American identity, American politics, and the American way of truth. So, for example, yesterday we saw a very interesting talk about Blake. This is Shaw's take on Blake. A lot of his work uses, as I say, sort of pop culture vernacular imagery. Here you can see the four beasts, but you can also see Superman, who appears in this sort of mashup appearing as a kind of, in a way, stand-in for humanity, or as he says, a kind of father figure, better than life, bigger than us, but still kind of vulnerable to, the trials and tribulations of humanities. He's also in a kind of another very extensive work that deals with this notion of the kind of tribulations of humanities. Is a work called My Mirage, and this is a huge installation work. This is just one image from it, and it's basically a lightly autobiographical coming-of-age narrative, which in some ways relates to John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress. And it's a story of Billy, a middle-class boy from the Midwest, like Shaw himself, who in the 60s goes through a drug and sex odyssey in quest of meaning, as in a way Shaw did. However, unlike Shaw, becomes born again as a fundamentalist Christian and a rather questionable televangelist. And he presents it in this narrative. It's kind of fascinating because he uses, in the different phases of Billy's life, he uses vernacular imagery, again, that comes from revelations, comes from the kind of materials he's collected, but also reflects the mindset of Billy at that time. So, you know, when he's in the drug, you know, time, it's a lot of his psychedelia. Then, you know, when he's a televangelist, you kind of revert back to a lot of these kinds of materials that you find in his collection. Here, of course, you see, you know, and this is not unlike a lot of the things in his collection, this kind of strange mix of realism and visionary and sort of weirdly prosaic, in a way, depictions of the images from the Book of Revelation. He's also done a whole series that he calls Left Behind. And his Left Behind paintings refer to the best-selling Christian novels and films, which update the Book of Revelation by chronicling the contemporary struggles of those who have been left behind to deal with the great tribulations after the believers have literally been raptured out of their homes, cars, and airplanes. And so it's a very popular, amazingly popular set of novels and movies. And Shaw's version of them paints them, he found a series of kind of theatrical backdrops, and he just took them and he painted over them these kind of comic overlays that take images from popular culture, politics, 50s era advertising, to create allegorical paintings that he talks about as capitalizing on the link between the fundamentalist rapture, this notion of being left behind, and the American working class, also left behind. So there's a kind of political undercurrent to a lot of his work. So, for example, in this one, we see behind us the White House. We see a nuclear explosion, which is created by sort of expanding intestines and floating, you know, kind of like these relics, you know, or maybe celestial visitors are these elements of kind of American consumerism. And also here, in a way, maybe his comment on American exceptionalism, U.S. presidents. Here is a kind of version of the American flag, but the stripes are these snakes, as you can see, and the stars are a compendium of all the U.S. presidents from George Washington to G.W. Bush, who was the president at the time that this was created. So again, a kind of dark, comic but dark vision of this notion of kind of America and its special status and relationship to God. He also did a very extensive installation called the Wig Museum, and this was in an old Masonic temple in Los Angeles where he lives. And it was, again, it was full of many things using different styles that he created and some that he appropriated, devoted to the notion of the decline of the West. And I'm just showing here this in one section, this kind of Hollywood version of the Day of Judgment. Again, drawing on his skills working on kind of these sort of offbeat Hollywood films. But if his work, and there is, as we've said, within the Book of Revelation, and has come out you know, in other talks, there is this kind of tug between the destructive, you know, kind of dark vision, and then the idea of salvation and redemption at the end. And that appears in his work as well, because Shaw has created what he calls his own religion called Oism. And it is, there's a whole elaborate narrative that he has created surrounding it. It's a invented goddess-centered religion that, according to him, was founded in upstate New York in the mid-1800s. It has echoes of Bloom's American religions, echoes of Mormonism, Scientology, Christian Science, and basically the whole American utopian tradition. And it's, what you see here is from a, could somebody bring me a little water, actually? This is a video of a, you know, kind of of a performance that he did, you know, of sort of the Oist, you know, kind of, in a way, you know, acolytes here, presenting this kind of very, you know, sort of rapturous a reflection of the utopia of the saved. So his work is very much about I think, the American version of the book of Revelation, and particularly the way that it relates to America's continuing Manichean mindset, this continuing emphasis on insiders, outsiders, good versus evil, etc. And the intimate tie between American identity, America's cultural mythology, and, again, visions of the apocalypse. Now, I'm turning next to Roger Brown, who is another artist who, again, uses a kind of, oh, thank you. I should have brought one up. Excuse me. Who uses the vernacular kind of style and idiom to talk about these issues. Roger Brown was raised in Alabama in the Church of Christ, again another kind of very evangelical, fundamentalist American religion in Bloom's sense. He considered entering the ministry, but he ended up going to art school and then coming out as an artist and a gay man in Chicago. And his work involves a kind of a neo-naive style that is indebted in a way to artists like Finster and William Thomas Thompson, and also to comics, folk art, cinematic posters, and surrealism. And it has this sort of deliberate naivete and innocence, which then deliberately contrasts with an often much darker vision. And he's done a lot of, he did many different kinds of images, but a lot of his work was really infused with biblical imagery. And that's what I want to talk about here, and particularly the book of Revelation. So there are works like this which are directly representations of images from the book of Revelation. Here, the beast rising from the sea. But as you can see, kind of a less fearsome beast in a way than, say, William Thomas Thompson or Howard Finster would produce. This beast feels somewhat defanged. There also are a number of kind of representations of the actual apocalypse, and here, as he says, an actual dream of the second coming. Here it has been transported to a city that's very much like the city of Chicago, where Brown spent most of his life. He also did works like this, The Seven Last Plagues, again coming from the book of Revelation and the apocalyptic narrative, but bringing it again into a kind of contemporary moment here. So you see modern day figures here, but they're buffeted by things like, you see drought here up on the corner, you see famine, plague, pollution, and of course moral decadence, very much, you know, one of the plagues that his religion of his upbringing was kind of very involved with, very railing against. But in fact, you know, his work also raises the question of what do we mean by moral decadence. And so in this work, he gives you, again, another version of the end of the world, of the apocalypse, of the post-apocalyptic order of things, but he calls it the devil's surprise, because what you see here is that the, you know, good churchgoers here sitting down here in hell listening to the preacher, and above, you know, are the gay, you know, couples enjoying heaven, and so suggesting that in fact there is, if there is going to be a separation of the damned and the saved at the end of time, perhaps, you know, perhaps we've got the whole configuration wrong. The next artist I want to talk about is Keith Haring, whose work offered a similar mix of this kind of deliberate stylistic naivete and more subversive messages. Again, like Roger Brown, he was raised in a very evangelical background. He was raised in the United Church of Christ, which was a kind of hellfire and brimstone version of Christianity that said that the damned will not just be sent to hell, but will be totally destroyed and obliterated after the second coming of Christ. As a teen, he rejected that really, you know, kind of very dark vision, but he was involved for a while with the Jesus movement, which was a countercultural version of Christianity, emphasizing more the love of Christ rather than, you know, the kind of dark, destructive impulses of the book of Revelation. Then he became an artist, and like Roger Brown, he came out, he was gay. And he's best known even now for his, what are seen as these kind of light-hearted graffiti works. He was a graffiti artist. He first came to notice because he would draw these kind of anonymous, simple drawings on the subway, the black paper in the subway of New York City, before they put posters up, and they would just sort of appear. You'd come out of the subway and there would be this unmistakable Keith Haring drawing. And he developed a lexicon of images and motifs, and many of them, again, as you can see here, kind of referring to religion and even specifically to the Book of Revelation. Among his favorite motifs were things like crosses, halos, angels, demons, bleeding hearts, and his signature element, which we'll see in a minute, what he called the radiant child. And this was a child with rays coming out of him, and it was kind of a double reference. On the one hand, perhaps to enlightenment, to Christ's birth, but also to radioactive fallout. And there was a kind of dark and light side to both the work. And this became particularly clear in his kind of more private works, the works that weren't, sort of for, public consumption in the same way. So, for example, he did a series of works that he titled The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, an allusion, of course, to Blake, as we recall from yesterday, but which also celebrates this kind of dualistic version, again, brought into a contemporary idiom. So we see, again here, angels, demons, figures that seem reminiscent of the Book of Revelation, but then we also see flying saucers. It's a kind of whole mix, and again, again, this sort of division between the saved and the damned, which is organizing this drawing. He also did a series of prints in collaboration with William Burroughs called Apocalypse. And each of these is centered on an image taken from advertising, art history, or Christian theology. And again, here's a particularly apocalyptic one. We see, perhaps the faithful, the left behind, underneath this kind of horrendous-looking mushroom cloud. He also did a number of works which were directly inspired by the Book of Revelation. And I show one here, and you can see here, in fact, you see the whore of Babylon, who here actually has been equipped with an enormous phallus, the seven-headed beast, many of again, these kind of familiar figures from the Book of Revelation. But like Jim Shaw and like Roger Brown, it wasn't all darkness. There was also, and again, this is sort of part of that apocalyptic imagination, this other redemptive side. And in fact, his last work was this one called The Life of Christ, which is an altarpiece which is today it was commissioned by and remains in the Cathedral of St. John the Divine in New York City. And you can see here is Christ, the Christ child here, with the radiant child here definitely is Christ sort of rising to heaven. And it's a kind of sense, a depiction of Haring's hope for the future, which is embodied in the eschatological narrative. So even though, in a way, like Roger Brown, the rejecting perhaps, certain aspects of this vision, this apocalyptic vision, particularly those that negated his identity as a gay man, but also, embracing that sort of sense of hope and potential for redemption in the future. A darker vision comes to us from Raymond Pettibon, who was raised as a Christian Scientist over the objections of his Catholic father, and came of age in the 1970s. In the 80s, he was very involved with the punk scene through his brother's band, the Black Flag, and got quite a name for himself, doing kind of punk kind of posters and zines and kind of various comics, graphic novels, etc. However, he moved from doing kind of album covers and this kind of work into art, and began to create collage-like drawings and wall works that they're very interesting because they mingle references to high and low culture. And I think another kind of thread that's been going on throughout the conference here is this kind of relationship between words and images, and that's something that's very important in his work. And a lot of the texts, they're very text heavy often, and the texts are kind of weird amalgams, very, that sort of come from various literary sources. They're also kind of almost hallucinogenic, kind of dream imagery, things that come to him in dreams, and then paired again with sort of this cartoonish imagery, which I'll show you some examples in a moment. And the purpose of the work is really to raise, it's a very anti-utopian view. And again, perhaps coming from his positioning as, the punk era, looking back at the utopian dreams of the 1960s, again, which themselves were sort of maybe tied to this idea of American exceptionalism and the city on the hill, and instead seeing the failure of these dreams. And so a lot of the work is about the false promises of politics, religion, art, drugs, sex, and rock and roll. One motif that he explored quite a bit was the motif of Charles Manson, who was, of course, the killer of Sharon Tate and the kind of charismatic leader of this sort of band of kind of frightening, acolytes. Manson himself was inspired by the biblical apocalypse as interpreted through the Beatles song Helter Skelter, and this was, of course, one of the things that was scrawled on the wall during the massacre of Sharon Tate and her house guests. This sort of it's really one of those incidents from the late 60s that sort of seared into the American imagination. And Pettibon talks about the fact that as a child, he was just a child at that time, that a neighbor described Manson as the personification of evil, and that remained with him. And so he presents Manson really as the Antichrist, the false prophet who seduces the masses. And so in his work, it's often hard to tell the difference between Christ and Manson. They seem to be alter egos here. So there is work like this that directly, talks about these tropes from the Book of Revelation, but he also does apocalyptic themes that sort of are maybe a bit more general. Fire, swords, mushroom clouds, etc. As we can see here, a lot of that, and that sort of notion of the kind of the Cold War, the potential to end civilization as we know it, which sort of hangs over kind of post-war American society and consciousness. Come the Iraq War, he began to reinterpret some of this imagery to talk about the shock and awe itself, a kind of phrase that comes out of the Book of Revelation, and to talk about the way in which this notion of kind of evil had been repurposed by American politics as a justification for this war. So it's very anti-war imagery. But again, like the other artists I've been talking about, although it's very dark and very dystopian, there is in his work as well a kind of redemptive side, a fascination with the redemptive side of the apocalyptic imagination. And for him, it's surfing. And he's talked about surfing as his image of the sublime. And in a sense, this tiny figure surrounded by the waves become, kind of this sense of sort of transcendence. And he has many, many images of surfing. Okay, next up is Paul Chan. Paul Chan is he's an artist. He was raised in the Bible Belt of Nebraska, and he has a fascination with religion's role in politics and pop culture. Also, like Pettibon, he was sort of galvanized into thinking about religion during the Middle East adventures of George Bush and since. And the way in which sort of the notion of the clash of civilizations has had this very major kind of impact on how Americans seem to think about their role in the world. So he works in many different media, but I'm going to show a couple of video works that he has done. This is from a very kind of complex video piece, and there's 4 cells from the video piece. So this is, you know, it's one screen, but these are 4 images that one might see. And it's basically an homage to, on the one hand, Henry Darger, who is another outsider visionary artist influenced by the Book of Revelation, but who also has been a huge impact on a lot of American artists. And he was the creator of, like Hampton, sort of a massive work that wasn't discovered until after his death, which involved an epic battle between these 2 forces, the innocent Vivian girls and the evil Glandolinians. Anyway, it's a whole long thing, which I won't go into now. But here, Chan has conflated that with the 19th century French socialist Charles Fourier to create a kind of paradise lost, which suggests the inevitable intrusion of death and destruction into utopian versions of our social fantasies. And this is a kind of ongoing theme of his. Again, another video work. And this one is actually a large video in which it's a 2-sided video. So on one side, you see this, you walk around and you see the same scene, but as if from the back. So it's kind of very interesting. You literally can change your perspective. Here the setting is a bleak post-apocalyptic landscape dominated by a single dead tree, you know, echoes of Beckett, of course. And there are characters that move through it. They include vultures, hunters, suicide bombers, tourists, and 2 of Chan's real-life heroes, the filmmaker Pasolini and hip-hop star Biggie Smalls, both of whom were murdered. And so it's again this kind of very, you know, mixed media, but clearly apocalyptic vision that you know talks about this sort of this darkness and this desolation kind of at the heart of the American dream. Here's another side of it, and here you see this is this kind of sense of all these leaves of paper flying, and this is actually from apparently a sort of early on kind of Google application, but it has a very apocalyptic feel. And finally, the final work of his I want to show is The 7 Lights. And this was a work that he did after 9/11, and I think very influenced by that. And this is a computer-generated set of projections of shadows falling or rising behind a window frame. It's a series of 7 installation, you know, video installation on the floor of a darkened gallery. So you walk around and you see, and there, you know, things are moving up and down. And there are various quotidian objects, flocks of birds fly up, animals, cars, bikes, cell phones, iPods, and then in one of them finally humans, but where all the other objects are floating up, the humans are descending, coming down. And in one of them here there's also this telephone pole, which sort of is, it seems, a deliberate evocation of the cross. So there's a lot of kind of religious imagery involved in here. And it's been interpreted in a number of ways. It's been talked about in terms of Plato's, you know, the cave, the shadows in the cave. Also, of course, with the falling bodies, you know, a representation of the bodies that literally did fall after 9/11. But also, it's a kind of representation in a way of the Last Judgment, although in a kind of reverse way, because it's a kind of been called a reversal of rapture theory, because here the symbols of consumerist America, all these things, the iPods are all like flying up, ascending into heaven, and the human beings are falling from grace. So, next, Paul Pfieffer. Paul Pfieffer is the child of Methodist missionaries, and he works also in the video mode. His works involve digital manipulations of found and sometimes newly created film footage, but a lot of his work involves especially sports, little clips from actual kind of sports events, which is one reason you'll see things the resolution isn't great here. But he'll take these, events, and then he manipulates them. Often he removes certain elements, and then he'll take a tiny snippet of it, and he'll like just repeat it in a loop over and over. And so the result is a kind of weird sense of time sort of stuttering, instead of things moving forward, and especially in terms of a sports event, where it's all about, kind of moving towards the end game. But here it's like they're sort of stuck. And a number of the works have titles that are drawn from the Bible, like this one, Fragment of a Crucifixion after Francis Bacon. Okay, so this is a clip of a basketball player, and in this little clip you see him jumping elatedly after a successful shot in a stadium. But Chan has removed all the other players, even the ball, so you just have him sort of jumping, and again it's on this little loop. And as the title kind of indicates, it sort of, we're encouraged to think about it in relationship to Francis Bacon's crucifixion and the screaming Christ on the cross here, because you see here this open mouth, which, you know, a cry of victory, but then it also becomes sort of this cry of terror in a way in this context. Here, one that's based on the Four Horsemen, or the title, The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. And again, you know, it's a basketball scene. This video clip involves a figure. It's actually not, it's a peripheral figure in, you know, what would have been the original film clip. And so you see the secondary figures sort of jumping in an empty court. Again, things have been removed. And so there's a kind of sense here again that somehow the world as we know it has begun to disappear. And there's a whole thing, you know, yesterday, Elena talked about sort of time and sort of visionary time of apocalypse. And I think in a way, when you see these little clips, it captures something of that. Here's one, this is titled John 13. And this is from a passage in the Gospel of John that promises believers eternal life. And here it's a video loop where you see the game from the perspective of the ball. And the ball, you know, we just focus on the ball, we see the hands sort of come and go, but the ball just sort of hovers in the center. You know, and it's sort of this still center of this frenetic world. And this work, I think, relates very much to another work that has a very direct connection to the book of Revelation and the Apocalypse, which is a book called Study for Morning After the Deluge. And this is a reference, just quickly for your reference, again, a direct reference to the Turner painting here with the same title. The Turner painting, which shows us a whirl of blinding light above a small depiction of the brazen serpent that Moses erected in the desert as a cure for the plague, but really, again, about this kind of sense of just the world dissolving. And in Pfeiffer's version, he is evoking here both Genesis and Turner's painting with this repeated loop of the sunrise and the sunset. And he's taken the sunrise and the sunset, and then he's actually placed cut it in half and placed the two orbs together, so that it's the sun in a way is always rising and always setting. And it's set, you see it here in a way the horizon sort of moves, but the still center, again, like the basketball, is the sun. And again, this kind of sense that you know, that the world is beginning to disappear, and this evoking perhaps a time after time, the time when time shall be no more, as the book of Revelation says. Now, my final artist is Ed Ruscha, who is a California conceptual artist. And one thing I'd like to say is that a lot of these artists are not known generally in the art world for this kind of work or for this context, but I think that we can find that it's in fact an important undercurrent in their work. So this is the work of Ed Ruscha, who is a California conceptualist. He uses words, typefaces, and rudimentary images in a kind of very cinematic way. This is a kind of just a typical work of his, you know, and you see these messages on these kind of backdrops that, you know, they often seem to evoke, you know, landscape, but maybe also kind of Hollywood, you know, the last or the beginning of a kind of traditional Hollywood film. And he's generally understood as a commentator on Hollywood's image-saturated popular culture. But as a Roman Catholic, someone raised as a Roman Catholic, he's very fascinated also by mortality and the afterlife, and has done a number of works which are based on words from the Catechism. And again, going back to this theme that's been kind of running through many of the talks here, the notion of words as things in themselves here, so that they become kind of in a way, a way of dealing with the ineffable. How do we understand heaven and hell? And the word then, the word becomes the way that we enter into it. or here, you know, this kind of commentary, again, in the way that even within, you know, kind of heaven, there is hell, that the intermixedness of good and evil. He also, in the mid-70s, did a number of works that were kind of uncharacteristic for him. His miracle drawings, which had no words in them, but had these shafts of life bursting forth from dark skies. Again, this kind of interpenetration of darkness and light, good and evil. But what I particularly want to draw your attention to is a whole series of his works which talk about the end. And in certain ways they reference kind of the Hollywood, you know, kind of, again, Hollywood movies, that last scene, you know, where you see it's over and you see the end, and here, even this painting, even with these lines, kind of suggests a sort of scratchy, you know, kind of film at the very end of a, you know, kind of in the pre-digital era. But also the typeface is, this Gothic typeface seems to reference as well the Bible. And he did a whole different, many versions of that, and I'm going to leave you with this one, which is the kind of hellfire and brimstone version of the end, and suggesting that perhaps Hollywood is our contemporary version of the Book of Revelation. So to conclude, what artists that like these show us is, I think, the fact that the apocalyptic narrative has burrowed deeply into our imaginations, and that, you know, we continue to use it as a way of making sense of the world. But each age remakes the apocalypse in its own image, so that there is, on the one hand, a continuity and a break between how we understand all of these tropes from the Book of Revelation and other apocalyptic narratives. And so I want to end with a quote from Frank Kermode, whose brilliant book, A Sense of an Ending, talks about the kind of apocalyptic narrative in terms of literary theories. And he talks about this continuity, and he says, "It would be childish to argue in a discussion of how people behave under eschatological threat that nuclear bombs are more real and make one experience more authentic crisis feelings than armies in the sky." Thank you. So, we have a little
Thank
time.
you, Eleanor.
Yeah.
No, that's fine. Questions for Eleanor? Anyone? Yeah, Lena.
Thank you for a very inspiring presentation. I was very interested in the art. There seemed to be a common thread between the artists that you chose to show us in terms of the aesthetics, and that's what I found quite fascinating. And I felt that they were using, again, the visionary style, most of them.
Yeah.
There was a visionary style, psychedelic style, and graffiti, which is also quite interesting way of expressing being in and out the situation. And also there was a very strong liminality in all of these works and statements, including the use of words, which is not illustrative at all. It's actually very much part of the aesthetics.
Right.
And I was just was trying to see if you have something more to say just about the aesthetics as a way of expressing and delivering a message, because these works seem to be about protest and messages, and how, and what about their impact? I mean, how do they are being received?
Well, these, I think you're right. There's a kind of thread here. These, as I say, these artists are, I mean, they're very much in the kind of, you know, postmodern mode that Michelle was talking about yesterday, in the sense of you bringing together, you know, these kind of very disparate sources but remaking them in a new way. And I think because they're talking about this, you know, particularly in these works that I'm talking about, they're talking about a way of thinking about the world that comes, you know, it's sort of deeply embedded in kind of American consciousness. And so they look for a language to talk about that, which, you know, also is, in a way, you know, very deeply American. I mean, in the book that I'm writing, they're not all Americans. I have, you know, kind of other, you know, kind of a whole, I have a whole other, you know, set of issues that I'm dealing with in other chapters in the book. But here, yeah, I was very interested in kind of the Americanness of the whole thing. And again, going back to that kind of city on the hill and all of that. And yeah, so an American, as one thing they, I think, are pointing out is that American pop culture is also very much informed by this, even in a way that, you know, sometimes obviously, sometimes not so obviously. And so, you know, our way of approaching the world is completely informed, you know, by this apocalyptic, what I'm calling the apocalyptic imagination. So,
I wanted to ask.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
One sec. Where is the throne
it's
installation?
in, I believe, in Washington, D.C.
Washington,
yeah,
D.C.
I have not seen it in person, but
Right.
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I think actually, yes, it's in the Smithsonian collection.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Thanks. Thank you. That was brilliant. It was kind of, yeah, it was brilliant how you took us through so many diverse examples. I was really interested in how what seems to distinguish these apocalyptic artists from maybe artists from earlier ages is that you have to look at their sort of output as a whole to understand them as interpreters of revelation, whereas, I mean, obviously you always have to look at the whole body of work of an artist and their context, but in earlier ages, you know, you can pretty much look at a Dürer and kind of get their take on revelation, you know, look at the Dürer Apocalypse series and get his take on revelation, whereas these artists, you actually have to sort of look at a range of their images and particularly to get that sense of nuance that you were talking about the juxtaposition between the fire and brimstone and the more hopeful kind of elements of it. So I was really struck by that. I was also wondering, as I think, you know, like I looked into Robert Roberg a little bit.
Yes. Yeah. Oh, yeah. No. There's actually there's a whole lot of other
of course. But I was just wondering, where do you slot him in?
Yeah.
Do you slot him in with the Christian artists?
Oh no. I would put him. No, he's in with the visionary artists.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yes, yeah.
Like also, more of a critique.
Because he was also called. I mean, I think one of the differences between, you know, the visionary and the non-visionary is that for the visionary artists, they felt like they were called. They feel and felt that they were called. You know, they had a mission. Whereas the secular artists, you know, it's much more of a personal thing. I mean, they don't feel that they, you know, are speaking for, you know, God. I mean, they are using this imagery, and often they were raised in it and kind of imbued with it, but that they're using it for their own purposes. They're very conscious of the fact that they're using it for their own purposes, and that, you know, that they are not called to witness. The visionary artists, I think, you know, felt that they were called to witness, and although you could say that there's a kind of witnessing with the secular artists, but it's a more personal witnessing. Yeah. So I think that's kind of a distinction. But it is interesting that there is this overlap clearly in the language that they use, and that's why I think it's important to emphasize also their religious upbringing, because it gives you a sense of kind of where it comes from. And I guess part of my mission here also has been this book that I'm writing now is kind of a it comes out of an earlier book that I wrote about the Catholic imagination in contemporary art, and in which I was interested in looking at, again, a lot of, you know, kind of very mainstream it's actually mostly American artists in that book, who came from a Catholic background, but whose work was, you know, is very much informed by that, even if they have left the faith behind, and that it's a way of understanding artists who we think we know by looking at their, you know, kind of religious roots and realizing that, you know, these continue to reverberate and shape their worldview even after they ostensibly have left religion behind. So this book is a kind of continuation of that, but moving beyond Catholicism and looking at, you know, again, all these other, you know, various other religions. But also the way that, you know, the apocalypse maybe even has become a kind of secular religion in certain, you know, quarters as well. So, yes.
Michelle.
Thank you so much. That was amazeballs. Really loved it. I wanted to ask a little bit more. We had another question about the throne, but what I found so interesting was the public-private divide. That was the one that seemed to have that sense of the private, hidden in the rented space, created in like the interstices of his life. It was very different, and also the one that you foregrounded African American identity behind it, and also the only kind of a more 3D object as well. So I just wondered if you could expand on that, but also maybe talk about the privateness of that object compared to the other works.
Well, it's private, in the sense that he didn't, he never showed it in his life, and yet there was a public aspect in the sense that he felt called, and that he did feel that when he was done, that it would then be unveiled, and that it would then be a kind of rallying point. So it was sort of both. But it's interesting. I didn't show Henry Darker's work, but there's an interesting parallel between the two of them, because also Darker did the same thing, and worked for years privately. No one really knew about this thing. And it's interesting that what was what were they intending these works to be seen? And because they're unlike sort of conventional artists, it wasn't like their goal was exhibition, whatever, but clearly they were doing them for, not just for themselves. I think in both cases, they felt that they were doing it for a purpose, and that, that they had been called to this higher purpose. So it was private, but it was, I think that for Hampton, it would have been very happy to know that it now is in the collection of the Smithsonian and people come to see it, because I think they didn't want it, clearly to just disappear with them. This was their legacy. So it's an interesting sort of tension. You're right, sort of this public-private thing, but there's sort of maybe the need to create it in private, because the safe place to do this kind of work, away from the prying eyes, especially if they felt, and generally, a lot of these artists, particularly, Darger and also the Hampton, I think they felt like they were really outsiders, isolated. They were loners. They never married. They were. They didn't really have a larger society relationship, and so they needed a safe place to create. But they wanted it, I think, ultimately to come out.
Thank you. It just made me think as well of the. We were talking about Ethiopia early on, and the Ethiopic tradition of the Ark itself, the shiny box that's supposedly in the church that nobody ever sees, but at the same time has that numinous sense. Yeah. So I thought that was an interesting parallel. But anyway, brilliant. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Larry.
Has to be. Has to be Larry. Okay, Larry, what?
Last question from Larry.
Might be the last question of my life also. I don't know. Eleanor, could you talk about the relationship of comic superheroes to the
apocalypse?
You know what I'm talking about.
Indeed.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, sure. Again, one of the places where, the apocalyptic narrative, I think, has continued in our culture is superheroes, Marvel Comics, etc. There you see all of these same tropes, the battle of good and evil, the outsiders and the insiders, and often even, you have the sort of the Antichrist figure who appears to be, a messianic figure, but in fact is an agent of evil. So, yeah, you could argue that the whole superhero universe is constructed on the basis of, this apocalyptic narrative, which is probably something Michael, where's Michael? Is he here? Yes, I think Michael, has made that rather clear in his work as well. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much, Eleanor. Fantastic.
Okay.